Hi, I'm Selena. Welcome to my spooky recommendations video. By the way, if you can hear football noises, my roommate is watching a game, so yeah, that's why. And I'm filming because that's who I am as a person. I'm like the most unqualified person ever to give spooky recommendations because I've just only gotten into like horror and like spooky books like in the last like year, and I haven't even read that many, and they're not even that like creepy or spooky or whatever. They're just like kind of eerie in tone or like dark in tone. Like I'm not a seasoned thriller reader. I'm not a huge sort of like graphic horror reader, but I really like the bits of the genre I've read so far. Most of it is classic horror, so I'm just gonna warn you right now, this list is gonna be full of classics. But I wanted to do it anyway. I saw Murphy Napier do it and I was like, you know what? I think I've read more horror, even though most of it's classic, than I thought. Or at least if not horror, like dark fantasy, creepy, with multiple levels. So like if you are not a huge horror fan and you don't like lots of graphic stuff, but you're into mysteries or just like dark fantasy, like light dark fantasy, then I have that on here. If you're into more robust horror, I have a little bit of that on here as well. If you're into YA, I have one of those as well. So I've got a mix of things, and I thought, you know what, let's just make the list. I saw Murphy do it and I was like, you know what, I want to make my own, and so I'm making my own. So the first spooky sort of book I'm going to talk about is Lady Audley's Secret by Mary Elizabeth Braden. So this is probably the lightest of spooks on my list. This is much more a mystery book than it is a thriller or a horror book. This is a classic that was published in the 1830s, I believe, and it is part of a genre known as sensation fiction, which is a subgenre of gothic fiction, I think. And sensation fiction was really focused on getting you to feel things. It was getting you to be really immersed in the story and have, you know, thrills and excitement and emotion and adrenaline within the story. It doesn't necessarily do that with supernatural aspects. A lot of it, from what I can tell, seems to be grounded in reality, whereas gothic fiction tends to not do that. But sensation novels are seen as the precursors to mystery novels, and Lady Audley's Secret is the only sensation novel I've read so far, but I have some more that I want to check out. This was seen as like lowbrow fiction at the time, but honestly, I think this book is pretty masterful. This is a story about a man named Robert Audley who goes to visit his uncle, I believe, who has just remarried a very young woman who has now become Lady Audley of the house. And while Robert is visiting with one of his friends, George Talboys goes missing, and Robert Audley spends the rest of the book kind of trying to follow the clues of where Talboys went and what happened to him. To me, the mystery of this is pretty predictable, but honestly, at the time, I don't know that it would be because this was published serially, so it was coming in little chunks, and so people were, you know, they had time to figure out the clues and put them all together and speculate with each other. And I just love that idea. So if you're reading the whole book of this, it's kind of like binging a Netflix show instead of watching it as it comes out on TV. So just maybe keep that in mind and forgive maybe if the mystery seems a little predictable to you. It may not seem predictable to you. I will say I was never completely sure until probably a good bit through the book. And whether or not you know it or not, I feel like this is still such a good ride. Braden's writing is very immersive and just really interesting, and I was hooked with this book. I was hooked until the end. The ending did disappoint me a little bit, but and so I have backed this up to 4.5 stars, even though this is basically a 5-star book for me. I enjoyed it 5 stars worth. It's just the ending has some things that I don't love, but also there's ways to read them in ways that are a little more interesting, in my opinion. Next on the list, getting into some middle grade dark fantasy, I'm going to recommend you Coraline by Neil Gaiman. So Coraline, if you haven't seen the movie, I have not seen the movie, I read the book first. If you haven't seen the movie, this is about a girl named Coraline who finds a door in her house that leads her into a house that looks a lot like hers, with parents who are a lot like hers, except things are slightly different. And at first it seems for the better, but as Coraline sort of navigates this new house and this new world, she sort of realizes that maybe everything is not as it seems. It's a very sweet, short book that I think Neil Gaiman pulls off perfectly. It did everything it needed to do. I think it managed to be sort of creepy while also remaining an accessible book. This is a Neil Gaiman book, so his writing style is always very accessible, but he definitely manages to write to a younger audience, but also he doesn't write down to the younger audience. I don't know how to explain it any way other than that. I was an adult and I love this book. Coraline has a really nice atmosphere, and I would recommend it to even an older reader, but you know, it's probably not gonna creep you out too much. The next recommendation I'm gonna give is gonna be another classic, and that is The Yellow Wallpaper by Charlotte Perkins Gilman. I loved this short story. I think I've read it 3 times now. I've read it twice for classes in college, I think. Have I? Have I though? Maybe it's the other way around. Maybe it's twice for classes in high school and once in college. I don't know. All I know is I really, really, really enjoy this short story. It's maybe my favorite short story. I think it is my favorite short story, actually. Yeah, it is. And this is a really, really short story about a woman who is suffering from some mental distress, and she is put on the rest cure. If you don't know what the rest cure is, it was this cure where at the time, women generally who were diagnosed with something like hysteria or some sort of mental stress or distress in their life that was affecting their ability to function, they were put on the rest cure, which is like basically this cure where you do nothing. You are meant to sleep, lay down, you aren't meant to exercise your mind at all, you're not meant to exercise your body at all, so no reading, no writing, no walking, no exercise, no nothing. And so it basically was to give your brain like a recharge, and some women liked it, but most women did not. And this particular author was actually put on the rest cure herself, and she felt it made her worse. And so she basically writes a story about a woman who is put on the rest cure, and it makes her worse. And it's horrific and fun. Not fun because like this is a really tragic situation, but it's just so well written that like I have to recommend it to you, and the well writtenness of it makes it fun for me. So yeah, I highly recommend The Yellow Wallpaper. It's short, it's still on the side of like lighter horror, and it's short, so you know, it's over quickly. The next book I'm gonna recommend is a modern book, and it's another Neil Gaiman book because I'm a Neil Gaiman fan and I can't help myself. And that book is The Ocean at the End of the Lane by Neil Gaiman. So this is my favorite book by Neil Gaiman, and it is, I think, his best from what I've read of his work so far. It is a story of a man who returns to his childhood home for a funeral, and he starts going down memory lane, and as he does that, a lot of his childhood traumas and horrors come back to him. And this is a really short novel thing that is, I just think it's brilliant. I can't say more than that because it's so short, and you just need to go in and be immersed in Neil Gaiman's writing and this story and just get sucked in. It is one of my favorite books of all time. It's more disturbing than I would say like really horrific, but I will just say there's, you know, maybe some slight body horror, I guess. I'm thinking of one particular thing that happens in the beginning, which is just sort of weird, but not necessarily like gory. Like it's not like blood and guts body horror. It's just sort of uncomfortable. Then you also have some disturbing scenes later, and I'm gonna put trigger warnings for those down, or that scene down below. So just, you know, take care of yourself. If you think you need to check a trigger warning, maybe check the pinned comment. And then my final 4 are probably the most horror-like of all of the books, or one of them is more of a thriller, but they're probably the most like intense of all the books I'm going to recommend, but I don't know how to compare them because 2 of them are classic horror or classic thriller, and 2 of them are more modern. And so I think I'm just going to do the classics first and then the modern, because I feel like the modern has more graphic content that could be disturbing. So we're going to get into my favorite classic spooky books right now. First classic spooky book that I love is a fairly recent read for me, and I've already talked about it several times on this channel, I'm pretty sure, because I love it so much, and that is Carmilla by Sheridan Le Fanu, I think is how you say his name. This is a vampire novel, but it is not a sort of typical vampire novel. It's not exactly what you think of when you think of a vampire novel. This is a classic gothic horror novella. It's not a novel. Why do I keep saying novel? It's a novella. It's very short. It's very suspenseful. It has moments that I wasn't necessarily scared by this or any of the books. I was disturbed by Ocean at the End of the Lane, and I'm disturbed by some coming later, actually. This one has good horror in it. It's just that it didn't scare me. It may scare you, I don't know. I just think that this novella is genius, and I can't say anything more except that it's a vampire novel, just not what you think. To me, it's kind of subverts some of the vampire tropes and plays with them, but also this was written before Dracula, so I know that Dracula, Bram Stoker was basing Dracula off of Sheridan Le Fanu's portrayal of vampires in this, and also in another book called The Vampire, written by someone. And Carmilla is so good. I enjoyed myself reading this the entire way through. It was suspenseful, it was atmospheric, it was gothic, it was so good. It's probably my second favorite gothic novel, closely followed by Lady Audley's Secret, and obviously the next one I'm going to talk about is my absolute favorite gothic sort of novel. But yeah, let's just get into the next one. And the next one, my favorite gothic classic novel, is Rebecca by Daphne du Maurier. So this is a classic domestic thriller sort of book. It's sort of gothic, and it follows this unnamed narrator who falls in love very quickly with this widower who has recently been widowed, and he's out looking. And so they go back to his manor, and once they get to his manor, the narrator quickly finds out that everyone there is sort of obsessed with Maxim, that's her husband's late wife, Rebecca. And so things are not quite as they seem. This author, Daphne du Maurier, is really good at creating atmosphere. She's really good at weaving suspense and unsettling feelings into her books in a very subtle way that builds and builds and builds and builds and builds and ends fantastically. And so I think this is the best of the classic novels that I've recommended to you so far. I've read other gothic novels, and I'm sure they could also go on this list: Frankenstein, Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, Picture of Dorian Gray, Jane Eyre. All those are gothic. I like Rebecca better than all of them, and I like the ones on this list better than the ones I just mentioned. But you know, there's lots of classics. I think Rebecca takes the cake, and I think you should totally read it if you like thrillers. It's not quite in the style of a domestic thriller today, from what I can tell, but it is really, really good. Okay, number 7 on this list. So this is something I don't do often, and I'm gonna recommend a sequel, or the second book in a series, basically. And the series I'm talking about is the John Cleaver series by Dan Wells. And that series starts with I'm Not a Serial Killer. I gave this book like 2.5 stars. I thought it was pretty mediocre, but you know, you might like it. My friend Udi loves it a lot. And what's really interesting about the series is the character. We follow this character named John Cleaver, who is a really well fleshed out character, and he has some violent, murderous tendencies that he kind of corrects in himself and regulates in himself. He has all these rules that he cannot allow him to break because he's worried that he will give in to his murderous tendencies and actually murder someone. But because he has those murderous tendencies, it also makes him really good at seeing them in other people, or, you know, finding out what is going on with, you know, murders. And so some murders start happening in his town, and he is trying to find the source and do away with them. This is a YA book. I would say that it's more of a YA paranormal than actually true horror than at this point, because honestly, there's a thing that Dan Wells does that sort of sucks all the tension out of this book to me. So I didn't love it, but I did really, really enjoy the sequel, and that is the one I'm gonna recommend because wow. The sequel is called Mr. Monster, and you do have to read book 1 in order to know what's happening with book 2, but I would say that, having not finished the series yet, that reading book 1 is worth it to get to book 2, because book 2, to me, had Dan Wells been able to reorganize the series to make like Mr. Monster like a standalone, or the first book in the series, or something of that sort, this would have been a 5-star book. This would have been amazing. In this book, we follow John Cleaver dealing with the repercussions of what he did in book 1, and had the things that his psyche is sort of going through, but also as things start going down in his town again. And I cannot say more because this is a sequel, but what I can say is that this is actually a YA horror, and it's actually disturbing. Dan Wells takes this in places that I was not expecting it to go. There is a sort of unsettlement that creeps into day-to-day life. It intrudes in day-to-day life. And then you also have John Cleaver's mental state sort of going to darker places than that we went in book 1. And all this sort of culminates in the last like third of the book, or like the last half of the book, and it is just, it's great. I would say if you like It by Stephen King and the Silence of the Lambs movie, I've never read the Silence of the Lambs book, and I've talking about the book It, not the movie It, because I don't like the movie It. If you like those books, then Mr. Monster I would say deals with similar themes and just like sort of plot points in a really masterful way. And so you might get those vibes while you're reading. I certainly did. And if you like those books and you want to see a YA book do a version of those and pull it off, in my opinion, like so well, then I would recommend Mr. Monster. And sadly, that means I have to recommend I Don't Want to Kill You as well. Moving on, the final recommendation I have for you today is It by Stephen King, which I just mentioned. I really like It by Stephen King. I will just say Stephen King has been accused of racism. He's not had the best responses to some recent things going on, so just know that about him going in, I guess. But I really liked it, and this is probably the most horrific novel that I have read so far, so I need to, I had to put it on the horror list. I loved this book. I thought it was so good. This is an 1,000-page book, over 1,000-page long book, but I never felt bored. I felt that everything was intentional. This was horror with a purpose. Felt like even though this was a character-driven book, there was a lot of plot happening, and that plot entirely related to the characters, their development, and it was just so well done. I loved it. I just thought it was masterfully written. This is a dual timeline book about a group of friends who has to deal with a murderous clown creature in their town that is kind of preying on the town when they were children, and then they have to return as adults to also deal with them. And so you get to flip back and forth between the kids as adults and the kids as children, and that is the way those plots tie together is really, really good. And I think that I don't know, I just don't know that anyone else but Stephen King could have pulled this off as well as he did. And I just think that it deserves its place as one of the most revered Stephen King books, despite some things that happen in the ending. I thoroughly enjoyed myself with this book. It actually did kind of thrill me or like scare me at times, kind of. I don't know if I could say like genuinely like scare me, but it did give me like a little like, ooh, I was not expecting that, what's gonna happen sort of thing. Suspense. It's great at suspense. It was a suspenseful ride, even though it's 1,000 pages. It is 1,000 pages of suspense. And so I think that this could be a good book to read this time of year if you're looking for something like that. However, there's tons of trigger warnings for it, and so I will be leaving those in the pinned comment down below. Also maybe Mr. Monster. Yeah, probably Mr. Monster as well. Trigger warnings, check them. Anyways, thank you for watching this video. I hope you got some recommendations out of this, and I hope that I will be able to update this after, the next year, and I will hopefully have a lot more horrific books to recommend you. Thank you for watching, and I will see you next time. Bye.